Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, ladies and gents around the world, and welcome back to an Egypt that has at last restored its prestige, not only domestically but also internationally, among the various players of the late Bronze Age world, where in 1279 BC, Seti I has just kicked the bucket after an incredibly successful time at Egypt's helm, having smashed the Hittites in battle, reaffirmed Egypt's control over the region of Canaan and also to the south in Nubia. But in the very same year, 1279 BC, begins the reign of perhaps one of the most talked about pharaohs of all of history, Ramesses II, or as he is otherwise known, Ramesses the Great. To begin with, we have to first go back into the reign of Seti I, where the successes of Ramesses II had initially began. In the previous episode, we talked about how Seti I pushed Hittite forces back as far as the city of Kadesh, and alongside him during that battle and also entering the city in triumph alongside him was his son, Ramesses II. And although this was perhaps the first of Ramesses' successes, it certainly was not the last. For Ramesses II, upon taking the throne in 1279 BC, it appears was filled with ambition. Yet almost immediately, as is typical for a brand new pharaoh, Ramesses II was already beset by problems on multiple fronts. And not just from the Hittites, also from a band known as the Sherdan Sea Pirates. And as for these pirates, it appears very little is actually known about them. Even their point of origin remains a mystery. Theories range far and wide as to where these sea pirates came from, yet the most prominent theories among them put their point of origin as Anatolia, Ionia, and even as far away as Sardinia. Sea piracy, however, would present a major problem for the Egyptian Empire and its booming trade network. For in order to reach faraway markets such as Mycenae and Greece, and also to conduct trade with the Hittites' copper mining base at Cyprus, naval travel was absolutely crucial in keeping the gold flowing in this area of Egypt's trade routes. But that, however, was not the only problem faced by the Egyptians at this time. For when it came to warfare, the Egyptians were said to be masters of open field land battles, where they could use their chariots to easily weave in and out of enemy infantry units, cutting them down and shooting them down with archers as they rode through. Yet you've probably figured out that on the sea, chariots are a bit ineffective, and as far as military might goes, it wasn't there for Egypt in the naval department. Naval warfare was perhaps one of Egypt's greatest weaknesses, and through tackling this problem early on, perhaps Ramesses II was aware of this, yet we can't be sure. However, despite lacking prowess in the naval theatre, Egypt was lucky enough to have the strategic mind of Ramesses II firmly on their side. The ferocity of these pirates had become well known among Egyptian traders, with a stele at Tanis even noting their remarkable ability against merchant vessels coming in and out of Egypt's ports. Quote, "They came from the mist of the sea in their warships, and none were able to stand before them." Close quote. Unfortunately for the Sherdan, however, Ramesses was equally cunning. He placed troops in strategic points along Egypt's northern coast, particularly around the Nile Delta, where the wealthiest of Egypt's ports lay. Setting up a trap, merchant vessels departed from a port on Egypt's northern coast, with Ramesses II and his fleet laying in wait in the bay for the pirates to emerge and begin attacking the merchant vessels, where upon their appearance, he caught them completely by surprise, wiping out the Sheridan fleet and even capturing many of the Sheridan pirates and taking them prisoner. Yet in this battle, the peoples known as the Luka and the Shekelesh were also defeated upon the water, and it may look, for now, like these pirates are starting to band together. But that's a story for another day, and as of 1277 BC, the Sheridan Sea pirates had been officially dealt with Egypt's sea trade routes once again being safe. But what once again was not safe were Egypt's northernmost territories. That's right, the Hittites are back. They had once more begun to push into the region of Syria, egging on Canaanite princes to rebel against Egypt's authority over the region. And that they did, with Ramesses II being forced to march on the region of Canaan to suppress the rebellion. By 1275 BC, this rebellion in the region of Canaan was crushed, with one Canaanite prince having been mortally wounded in battle with the Egyptians. Yet this did not satisfy Ramesses II to simply pacify them and walk away. In fact, it is said that he returned every single year to extract tribute personally from the region of Canaan to ensure that it would not be a thorn in Egypt's side again. And perhaps Ramesses II did suspect the Hittite Empire of egging on the Canaanite princes. For in the 5th year of his reign, 1274 BC, Ramesses II went to war with the Hittite Empire, engaging the formidable Hittite army in the region of Syria under the command of their king Muwatallis. And it's in this Syrian campaign that we see the famous Great Battle of Kadesh, perhaps the single most well-documented battle of the entire Bronze Age. This battle began when the Hittite army ambushed the forces of Ramesses II and Ramesses II himself not far outside the city walls of Kadesh. Yet unexpectedly, the forces of Pharaoh Ramesses II counterattacked, routing the Hittite army and driving them back towards the city itself, where the army even made the desperate swim across the Orontes River to get back to the safety of the city walls of Kadesh. However though, Ramesses II did not have the materials at that time to sit out a long siege of the city. And so, the pharaoh returned to Egypt. Yet, strangely, he declared it a victory? Pretty sure if it's a victory, then he would have taken the city. And that's exactly why the Hittites also claimed that as a victory. Well, if that doesn't look like squabbles on a school playground, I don't know what does. But either way, Ramesses II for the next few years would rarely leave the Hittite Empire alone. In fact, in 1272 BC, Ramesses II with his mighty army once again pushed into Syria, using the tactic of splitting his main force into two, one force led by his son, Amun-her-Kepeshef, and the other led by Ramesses himself. The force under his son was able to smash the Shasu, who had allied with the Hittites in this war. Ramesses, on the other hand, was able to smash the main Hittite force, driving them back into Syria. Yet this did not stop him even here, for in 1271 BC and 1270 BC, Ramesses II with his huge army, around 100,000 strong, pushed as far into Egypt as Thutmosis III had done over 100 years before him, to the city of Tunip in what is now northern Syria. So it seemed that now Ramesses II had done what no pharaoh had done before. He and his army were even beginning to encroach on the Hittite heartlands. These military feats were nothing short of phenomenal for the time. Ramesses II, within the first decade of his reign, had not only absolutely obliterated the Shurden pirates, but had also smashed to bits the Hittite army and driven it even within the boundaries of their heartlands, near Anatolia itself. Despite this monumental victory, however, Ramesses II would not be able to hold on to these far-flung northern territories for long, because these territories were so far from Egypt's core territories that their hold on them was tentative at best, meaning that the Hittites could easily just send their army in and take it right back from under the nose of the Egyptian pharaoh. And that is exactly what happened. For little more than a year after this campaign, the Hittite army marched right back into their southern territories and took them back from the Egyptians. Yet Egypt's hold over Canaan and parts of Syria still remained firm, and on this frontier things between Egypt and Hattusa would begin to quieten down, with there being nothing more than perhaps border skirmishes and maybe the odd snatching back and forth of the city of Kadesh. Yet with this front secure, other fronts it appears were not quiet. The realm of Nubia, having been an Egyptian possession for around 2 centuries by this point, once again erupted in rebellion, and in crushing this rebellion, it appears that Ramesses II spared no resource, even being accompanied by some of his sons into Nubia to crush the rebellion. Ramesses II himself also claims that in one battle he did not even need the use of his army, being able to defeat a Nubian rebel force simply alongside his sons, who were all riding in chariots. Although, I don't know about the rest of you, but as awesome and badass as that claim sounds, I'm a bit skeptical. Because I mean, yes, Ramesses, you were amazing, but that would sound even a bit far-fetched, even for a pharaoh as great as him. This, however, in Nubia was not the only troublesome front. The Libyans had returned, but Ramesses II, ever the military tactician, was able to crush this incursion by the Libyan tribes. And to make sure they wouldn't become a threat again anytime soon, Ramesses II ordered the placement of a permanent military presence in the region, with a military presence being set up along Egypt's westernmost borders around the Mediterranean coast. But with these easy fronts dealt with, yet again the Hittite Empire became a bit of a major problem, although in a slightly different way than the previous 2 times Ramesses II had dealt with them. For you see, by this point, roughly around the year 1260 to 1258 BC, the Hittites had been facing a bit of a crisis. What with the Egyptians kicking them around in the Levant and Syria, and also having lost some territory to the now growing Assyrian Empire, the Hittites had perhaps become a bit fed up with their current king, Mircili III, who was then deposed in a coup led by his uncle, Hattusili III. As a result of this, the deposed king Mircili III fled to Egyptian territory to seek asylum with the Egyptian pharaoh Ramesses II. In response to this, Hattusili demanded the return of his nephew. Yet to begin with, Ramesses II flat out denied that he had any knowledge of the presence of Mircili III within Egyptian territory. This reply from the pharaoh greatly angered Hattusili III, and these 2 empires were once again close to a major war. Before hostilities could explode, however, Ramesses and Hattusili decided to conclude an agreement at Kadesh in 1258 BC. This agreement confirmed the border between the Hittite and Egyptian empires, and also laid the groundwork for an alliance between the Hittites and the Egyptians. This agreement was later known as the Treaty of Kadesh, and is actually the earliest known peace treaty in world history. And in terms of Bronze Age history, the Treaty of Kadesh is recognised as a key cornerstone of diplomacy between the Hittites and the Egyptians, for after this treaty was concluded, hostilities between the two empires ceased completely. There are even instances where several client states tried to encourage either empire to stab the other in the back. For example, the king of a client state known as Mirage tried to encourage Ramesses II to get involved in a rebellion against Hittite rule. However, Ramesses II refused, explaining that the days of intrigue against the Hittites had now passed. Another instance of this happening is between the Hittite ruler Hattusili III and the Kassite king of Babylon, of whom, when encouraged to rise up and fight the Egyptians, Hattusili simply responded that the Kassites oppose another enemy on their own, and that enemy would later be the Assyrian Empire. And I won't go into too much detail, but that didn't really go well for the Kassites in short. This treaty created such a strong alliance between the Egyptians and the Hittites that when the Assyrians eventually overwhelmed the Kassites and approached the Mediterranean coast, the two empires joined forces in order to prevent the Assyrian Empire from cutting off contact and trade routes between the Egyptian and Hittite empires, meaning that this region for now was incredibly secure, defended by both the Egyptians and the Hittites against the now growing Assyrian Empire to the east. But for now though, Egypt in terms of foreign policy was once again a Bronze Age powerhouse. And so in the year 1249 BC, with peace having at last been achieved and Egypt prospering once more, Ramesses II celebrated what is known as the Sed Festival. This festival had only been celebrated by a rare, very small handful of pharaohs before Ramesses himself. This festival was celebrated on the 30th year of a pharaoh's reign. It was meant to rejuvenate the pharaoh's strength so that then they could continue reigning for a few more years after said first Sed festival. Try saying that 10 times fast. But in either case, the Sed festival would be celebrated every 3 to 4 years after the 30th anniversary of a pharaoh taking the throne. Ramesses II, who ended up reigning for 66 years, would go on to celebrate an unprecedented 13 or 14 Sed festivals during the entirety of his reign. But it appears, however, that during his reign, Ramesses II didn't just enjoy kicking the Hittites around from time to time, he also appeared to be an incredibly active builder, perhaps more so than any other pharaoh that had come before him. In a move resembling the chaos of the times of Akhenaten, Ramesses moved the capital of the Egyptian Empire from Thebes to a brand new capital in the Nile Delta known as Pi-Ramesses, or its elongated name Pi-Ramesses-Ar-Nakhtu. This roughly translates to Domain of Ramesses, Great in Victory. This brand new city was built on top of the site of a summer palace originally constructed by Seti I, Ramesses II's immediate predecessor, and it seems perhaps that Ramesses II enjoyed governing from home, and governing from a place of beauty, for this brand new city has been described in its heyday as a place of absolute luxury and splendour, truly a beacon of Egypt's prosperity under its greatest pharaoh. However, this was far from the most ambitious of Ramesses II's building projects, for he built a mortuary temple dedicated to himself, whose original name has been lost to time, yet modern scholars have unceremoniously dubbed it the Ramesseum. And in ancient times it was said that this temple complex was colossal for the time, with the later Greek historian Diodorus Siculus even marvelling at the gargantuan size of this temple, parts of which still remain today, although as little more than a few ruins. And the extent of this site cannot be understated, for the remains of vast storerooms where mud bricks may have been housed have been found all around the site. This site was so vast that it even had its own school to teach the army of scribes that would have been required to depict reliefs of the pharaoh and his accomplishments all along the walls of this mighty complex. And speaking of mighty constructions, when talking about Ramesses II, one cannot leave out the great temple of Abu Simbel. This temple was constructed in the Egyptian realm of Nubia, the very same troublesome region that was prone to rebellion from time to time. It's said that in 1255 BC, Ramesses II and his then queen Nefertari travelled in person to the site to inaugurate this brand new temple, of which some modern scholars have literally described as an ego cast in stone. For great statues depicting Ramesses II himself still silently guard the site to this day. They still look down upon modern visitors to the site, perhaps arguably one of the most famous of Egypt's ancient sites besides the Great Pyramids of Giza. And with that we jump ahead to the year 1213 BC and the eventual passing of Ramesses the Great, who at the time of his passing had reached the grand old age of 90, something unheard of in the Bronze Age world, and his reign in its entirety has been estimated to have lasted 66 years and 2 months in total. During this time, Ramesses II is said to have had over 200 wives and concubines, giving him over 100 children in total, many of whom he outlived. And after a reign as long and fruitful as this, the death of Ramesses II came as such a shock to the Egyptian people that they believed that his death would bring about the end of days, the apocalypse itself. And little did these people know how correct they would be. For not very long after the death of Ramesses II, the Egyptian Empire would be plunged into the depths of civil war. So after taking a tour of the rest of the world during this mighty expanse of time, we will return to Egypt and the Fertile Crescent as we cover the end of civilization itself with what little we know of the Bronze Age collapse. And with that, folks, we have reached the end of our series on ancient Egypt, where we began with the Old Kingdom and Egypt's humble beginnings as little more than a kingdom under King Djoser around 5,000 years ago, right the way through the rest of the Old Kingdom, the Middle Kingdom, the New Kingdom, right the way up until Ramesses the Great himself. We have covered around 2,000 to 3,000 years of history in this one series. So stay tuned, for next time we uncover the civilizations that existed alongside the entirety of ancient Egypt's run at the top. We're talking the Shang dynasty of China, the return of the Sumerian city-states, Babylonia, the Assyrian Empire, the Hittites, and Mycenaean Greece. And before I head off, I would just like to take a moment to thank you all for watching, engaging, and supporting this series throughout its run. But for now though, I'm Lewis of the Grand Portfolio, and thank you for watching.